Hey guys and girls, it is Logan Holmes. So I'm gonna be reacting to an article that published by The Week called "Sorry, the 2010s Aren't Over Yet." Um, Look, I'm just gonna say this. I do not agree with what this article is saying. And here's why. Time is not always governed by the calendar. The 20th century ran a few years shy of 100, getting a late start with the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and ending, depending on who you ask, either with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 or the September 11th attacks in 2001. So, okay, from this first paragraph, we know that this is from a political viewpoint. Um, so there are much more things you could use instead of politics. Okay, in that middle of that short century, however, the 1960s were a long decade. The events and cultural markers we associate with the 60s are not neatly confirmed between 1960 and 1969, but stretch, as British historian Arthur Marwick has posted, from 1958 to 1974. Marwick chose the latter date, as he explains the 60s, because it was then that the mass of ordinary people began to feel the effects of the oil crisis, which started in late 1973, because some of the crucial developments initiated in the 60s only culminated then, and because only in August, with Congress drastically cutting aid to Saigon and Nixon resigning, did the anti-war movement feel it was achieving victory. Okay, look, this is there are more things you could use to, with the 60s, if you want to look at it, like, if you don't think that a decade could be like that. Like, if you think that a decade isn't always 10 years, like, for example, like, music is a good one here. You could use the breakup of the Beatles, which, of course, that happened in 1970. And you could use the Beatles as a huge example, because the Beatles formed in 1960 and broke up in 1970. So in the music world, the Beatles would be a hugely part. The breakup of the Beatles was truly the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. At least I feel. Or you could say the 70s started early because Led Zeppelin formed in 1968 and they broke up in 1980. If you like to, just look at it like that, with Beatles 70s, Led Zeppelin, and or Beatles 60s, Led Zeppelin 70s, and I could go on. Okay, but anyway, the felt boundaries of a decade then are not necessarily limited by its actual years. The tentures of presidents, the progression of war and peace, the course of economic booms and busts, even the meandering of style in clothes and music can all shrink or expand a decade beyond its normal limits. And I suspect, like the 1960s, the 2010s will be measured long. I don't say this with pleasure. My sense is that many of us want this new year to be a clean break. We are politically exhausted and eager for a new era of normalcy, whatever our political uh, affinities tell us that means. We are tired of a constant feeling of apogee, of careening from one crisis, one threat to the next. Unfortunately, there is no reason to think 2020 has brought this wild decade to a close. I would say the current decade essentially began with the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, argues Jason Mujanovic, a political scientist at Elon University, whose tweet thread on the long 2010s provided the language I was seeking for this column. Mind of you, one could make an argument for reframing all this in light of 9/11, Mujanovic told me, but I'm of the belief that the financial crisis was a watershed moment in its own right, one that carried with it a lot of the features and iniquities of the post 9/11 world, but unleashed a new, still more essential form of politics in much of the West in particular. Okay, I think. Okay, so this, the financial crisis. I'd say more that the financial crisis would be the end of the 2000s, because the financial crisis, like, only you say it's 2008 to 2009. I do think the financial crisis, it did go into 2010, I'm pretty sure. Let me look. Okay, the financial crisis was from 2007 to 2008. So yeah, this was all within the 2000s. Oh, and then there's, of course, so the financial crisis was followed by the Great Recession, which yeah, it ended in June 2009. So maybe so so the financial crisis was all within the 2000s. So um and you're saying that this began the 2020 the 2010s? Um I say, if you want to look at it like that, I'd say it was the 2010s began when Obama was elected president. Because I mean Obama was put the financial crisis to an end. So and people like, and Obama was pretty much the president of the 2010s um because he was president for most of the decade. And then you have uh George W. Bush was the president of the 2000s. Clinton was the president of the 90s. Reagan was the president of the 80s. Nixon was the president of the 70s. Um, LBJ was the president of the 60s. Eisenhower was the president of the 50s. And then you could say you get to where. But then a problem that would come up was that, FDR was the president for the majority of the 30s and the 40s. So that creates a problem if you want to make a decade there. So, yeah. And if you go by this definition, and if Trump gets a full second term, then he'll be the president of the 2020s, which would mean that the 2020s started early. And uh, particularly for my generation and our boomer parents, I graduated college 9 months after Lehman Brothers collapse, and many of my peers saw their families' homes repossessed as they came into adulthood. 2008 feels like a clear dividing line, the first time 9/11 was superseded as a preoccupying catastrophe. But if the financial crisis started in the 2010s, what closes the decade is difficult to predict. I'm inclined to name 2021 as the soonest conceivable end date, a timeline only possible if President Trump loses his re-election campaign. Mujanabek's forecast is longer. I can't see most of the major dynamics of the present: the war in Syria, the rise of the Western far right, Russian revanchism, American decline, and Chinese ascendancy, the internal crisis of the European Union combined with the chaos of Brexit, the catalysmatic realities of accelerating climate change, etc., playing themselves out before 2025, he said. And realistically, I think we're going to be having many of the same conversations well into the 2030s. That would be a long decade indeed. It's a strange thing to conceptualize a long decade while you're still in it, a bit like breaking the fourth wall of history to monologue, well, everyone. But there is some value in thinking of our time this way. It adjusts our expectations for 2020, tapering down to unrealistic hopes and fears alike. There will be change in the coming year as in every year, but we can mostly anticipate continuity. Take a breath. More particularly, forecasting a long 2010s, encouraging taking the long view of what Mujanovic called the cluster of intertwined crosses that demand our constant attention. Their resolution is not high. We will be dealing with present problems and their efforts for years to come. I think all of us would do well, especially those with real political influence and power, to step back and think about where we want the world to be in 20 or 30 years, Mujanovic advised. That means thinking past the next election cycle and the one after that, which is basically contemplating eternity so far as the American polity is concerned. It is a contemplation we must brave. My annual New Year's Eve cocktail party marked the end of the year and only the year. For whenever the end of the long 2010s may arrive, it won't be this New Year's Day. We aren't getting off that easy. Okay, so this is a really bad article because, number one, it's pretty much entirely from a political point of view. And then the second thing is the financial crisis of 2000, from 2007 to 2009. That was when that lasted. So that never even went into the real 2010s. So that's kind of bad. So yeah, like, we had two in 2019. There were two big movies, Endgame and The Last Jedi. Or no, not The Last Jedi. The Rise of Skywalker. So those two movies really put pretty much an end to the 2010s, and I say for sure. And and the 2020s, we're about to have the Jeopardy Tournament of Champions between Brad Brother, Ken Jennings, and James Holzhauer. So that right there is definitely a start of the decade. So here's the thing: if you want to look at it, you can't look entirely from a political view. Because this here, like the whole thing with the 60s, it never even mentioned the Beatles or Led Zeppelin, which I feel like are pretty big if you're going to talk about the 60s. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And peace out, fans.